Abraham Lincoln almost has semi-deity status in America.
Yes. Yes.
And of course, you could say it's the confluence of how he died, I mean, it was Holy Week, etc. But you, in your work, I gather, speak to how he framed his public pronouncements in many ways, or they were inspired in many ways by his own reflections on spirituality, so maybe could you help us understand that a little better?
Lincoln is an unusual combination of ideas. On the one hand, he is raised in a very seriously religious environment, and he carries with him the impress of that raising all through his life. He's the sort of person who can easily, readily, without any difficulty, quote the Bible at particularly important moments. He will frame his great argument against slavery in terms of its offense to natural law and to revealed religion. And as president, he has more to say on the subject of God's providence and God's direction of public affairs than almost any other president, maybe, in fact, all the other presidents combined. I mean, especially in his second inaugural address. That's the closest thing that you get from a political figure in America that could amount to a sermon. It's a remarkable document. So you find, on the one hand, in Lincoln, so much of what he does, publicly and privately, is bound up with and reflects his interest in religious questions. And yet, always with Abraham Lincoln, there's an and yet, because the man is a very complicated man. The and yet is the fact that he never joins a church or a religious congregation, never makes any commitment. We have no record that he is ever baptized, takes communion, does this or that in any formal religious way. And he did that not accidentally. He was very conscious of the political price that he paid for not having that kind of religious identity. When he was running for Congress back in 1847, his opponent, his rival, Peter Cartwright, made a lot of hay out of that to voters in Illinois. It's like, how can you vote for this man, Lincoln? He's an unbeliever, he's an infidel, you can't trust him. And he could have taken very easily a short circuit. Given who Abraham Lincoln was there any pastor or board of elders who would refuse an application from him for membership? No, they'd wave him in. Yeah, sure. He never does that, never tries to do it. And when people try to press him on religious questions about himself, he'll usually divert the answer in some other direction.
And is that because you think his thinking is so pure and authentic, and therefore he wasn't prepared to be expedient about it, or what?
I think that's a large measure of it. I think that's where the two parts of this intersect. He was raised very stern, strict Calvinist. Nothing happens in the world except God makes it happen. Now, what that meant was that in his personal life, if he believed that he was what Calvinism would tell you you are, and that is a sinner, you don't make yourself better by your own efforts. You don't work your way up. You have to wait for God to move. And he had enough integrity and honesty within himself to say, I haven't felt God move me in that direction. Therefore, I'm not going to try and claim it. And I'm certainly not going to try to advertise myself falsely. So it's exactly that integrity that brings those two parts of Lincoln and his internal life together. But it also makes him a puzzle. After his death, his law partner, William Herndon, interviewed David Davis, who had been the judge out on the Illinois 8th Judicial Circuit, and whom Lincoln appoints to the Supreme Court in 1862. And Herndon said, what about Lincoln's religion? And Davis replied, I don't know anything about Lincoln's religion, and neither does anybody else, because he just never would talk about it to people. So he keeps so much of that back. He keeps it back. Well, personally, yes, there's a certain prudential aspect to it. He doesn't want to give people sticks to beat him with. publicly. But at the same time, he also doesn't want to talk about it because for him, there is a very intense wrestle. There's a very intense confrontation within himself that he's dealing with because he is convinced, it's the way he's been taught, that if God is going to accept you, then God is going to make that movement. You're not going to be able to do it yourself. And you just see that run through his life straight to the end.
So a lot of people, Dr. Guelzo, have suggested that Lincoln turned, for example, at the Gettysburg Address to the Declaration of Independence because he could hardly reference the Constitution at that point, because by then the notion was we were going to significantly define this Civil War, not by regional differences, but over the issue of the moral issue of emancipation. But yet you're suggested in some of what you've written that that was always at the core of his thinking.
Oh, yeah.
That it, and how was that? I mean, what drove him to embrace the document that was not binding as
that's right.
central mantra of the country?
That's right. I mean, if you get pulled over by a state trooper for speeding on the turnpike and start quoting the Declaration of Independence, it's not going to get you anything, is it?
Right. No.
Well, here's the thing. What Lincoln saw in the Declaration of Independence was something he resonated with himself, and which he believed made others resonate too, just by the idea itself. He said on his inaugural journey to Washington, he stops at Independence Hall, gives a speech there. This is February 22nd, 1861. He says, "I have never had a thought politically that did not originate in that hall," meaning the Declaration of Independence. Mm-hmm. For him, the Declaration, that was the touchstone of American identity. And he takes people to the Declaration over and over and over and over again. He does it all through his great debates with Stephen A. Douglas in 1858. Basically, he asks, how can Douglas apologize as he does for slave owning and then reconcile that with the Declaration of Independence? In one of his greatest speeches, this is July 10th, 1858, he says, half the people in this country have come from someplace else. You know, maybe one half of the country can still say, yeah, we're sons of the American Revolution or daughters of the American Revolution. But the other half of the country, they've come from other places around the world. They don't feel any living family connection to the revolution. But he said, when they read in the Declaration those words, that all men are created equal, then he said they feel that they are flesh of the flesh and blood of the blood of those men that wrote the Declaration, and so they are. He said that's the electric cord that unites all lovers of liberty. For him, what Jefferson called self-evident as these truths that we attest to, for him, self-evident, that was there. You didn't have to prove it. It was like geometry. You start out with an axiom. You don't have to prove it. It's there. It's true. Everyone sees it and recognizes it the moment they read it. And that loyalty to the Declaration runs straight through his political life, runs straight through his presidency. And when he begins the Gettysburg Address, where he's trying to explain to people, why are we fighting this terrible war?
Yeah.
It has cost the lives of all these young men who are buried here in this cemetery in Gettysburg. He says, we were conceived in liberty and dedicated to a proposition that all men are created equal. That's where we begin as a nation. That's where we thrive as a nation. That's the goal to which we should be driving as a nation. And if we'll do that, if we'll dedicate ourselves to that proposition, the same way these soldiers did, then this nation will have a new birth of freedom, and government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The bright line of the Declaration just runs straight through Lincoln's public life.
Well, we can come back to it, but, I found it interesting that the three men who were so pivotal to bringing the capital to this region, and they were typical of those who were at that constitutional convention, were a privileged class. Whereas the three men now who we identify as pivotal to it moving into a meaningful metropolis are all people who are born into a hard scrabble life.
Yeah.
Lincoln, nothing. Douglas almost less than nothing,
Yes.
and Ulysses S. Grant. I mean, they are living proof of that dream, and so they may have a more of a personal, intellectual, emotional investment, in the Declaration of Independence. But let me ask you, if I may, something else. You said that in Fateful Lightning, that it was almost inevitable that we would reach a point of a disunion.
Yeah.
That when you think of how we began
Mm-hmm.
and how we saw ourselves, and so many people saw themselves as their country being South Carolina, North Carolina, whatever, not really the Union.
Mm-hmm.
Can you sort of elaborate on that it was almost inevitable that we would reach this point as we did in 1861?
Well, I'll say one thing about inevitability. I use that as a metaphor. Actually, nothing is inevitable. So much about contingency and change in history that it's always a good idea to keep your eye on the fact that history can turn on a dime. It can turn on a single decision. It can turn on what a single individual does. So I keep that in view. But at the same time, what I said in Fateful Lightning was the people who create the Constitution, they were not prophets. They did not have a glass bowl they could look in and see the future. And they had to deal with what they had and how they could see things going forward as best they could. Here's a case in point, and that is the issue of slavery in the Constitutional Convention. Half the delegates who come to Philadelphia in 1787 are slave owners. And the half of the country is committed to the slave system. In fact, when the Constitutional Convention convenes in Philadelphia in 1787, all but one state of the Union legalizes slavery, North and South alike. We sometimes talk about, well, the Northerners were this and the Southerners were this. Not in
Right.
1787. This
No.
is a surprise for people. So they come to the Constitutional Convention, and one thing which eventually becomes very apparent is they feel that there is a living contradiction between slavery and what they're trying to do in this Constitution. And they don't have an easy time of it. Some of them will stand up on the floor of the convention like Gouverneur Morris, and they will say, slavery has the testimony of heaven against it, and we are going to pay a price for this if we do not eradicate it. At the same time, you will get someone like the relatives like the Pinckneys from South Carolina standing up and saying, well, if you're going to try to touch slavery, we're leaving. We're not going to cooperate. Maybe we'll go back with the English. Who knows? But we're not going to cooperate with this union. What do? They sit down and try to think, well, where is it going? And that's the moment when you get people like Oliver Ellsworth, Roger Sherman, even James Madison will stand up on the floor of the convention with fully convinced of this. And they say, look, as best we can see here in 1787, slavery is a dying institution. It's going out, and it's going to go out fast. In a few years, there's not going to be any slavery in America, because that's where we see the trends going. So let's not talk about slavery in the Constitution. Especially, let's not give any hint that there can be what Madison called and Sherman called property in men. Just not even going to use the word, so that years from now, when people read the Constitution, there will be no trace of this thing called slavery in it. They really thought that slavery was on the way out the door, and all they had to do was let the dying dog die. And they were wrong. They had not. They had not anticipated the Industrial Revolution. They did not anticipated this
cotton gin
for cotton. So sometimes it is a matter of you don't see what the future is going to take, the direction it's going to take.
But is it correct to, slavery is definitely intrinsic to all of this. It's, as you know, as Lincoln says in his second inaugural, let's deal with what this was about. But there is also this notion of federalism.
Oh, yeah.
Which, you've rejected this imposing monarchy of Great Britain.
Mm-hmm.
This is where people are their point of view. And it probably was not an easy to accept a replacement of that, with this new quote unquote federal government, and not wanting to surrender power to this. So much of that seemed to be at the heart of it. I mean, as well, part of the undercurrents of that was around whether you'd accept slavery or not. Are you going to let slavery expand into the West or not? But at the heart of it, was it not? I mean, we are not going to have an imposing federal presence. And to me, what is so odd when you think about it, and I'll ask you, the real first president to establish that federal presence is seemingly Abraham Lincoln.
Well, to a certain extent, this is true. Although I will say that there really is a very steady arc of recognition of federal authority.
Okay.
Which moves up as early as Washington's presidency. Is where you first start to see the first glimmers of it. And sometimes we think, oh, well, Lincoln becomes president, he has to wage a civil war, he's got to muster the forces of the nation in defense of the federal government and the federal constitution, and that's where everything changes. Actually, the change has been very, very incremental, but it's been happening. And you see it with, for instance, Alexander Hamilton and the proposals for tariffs, for a national bank. You see it in a rather oddball way in Andrew Jackson, and the way Jackson responds to the South Carolina threats of nullification. Basically, he's saying our federal union, it must be preserved. That's the rebuke he hands out to John C. Calhoun. So by the time we get to Lincoln, what we're dealing with is, first of all, a man who is, politically speaking, he's a Whig. That's where his political allegiance begins. And the Whigs were always people who put the nation first. And if you put the nation first, then the federal aspect of our government, that becomes a vital aspect of things. When Lincoln becomes president, all right, the Whig Party is dead and buried after 1856. And Lincoln has now attached himself to this new Republican anti-slavery party. But in truth, when he's president, he's really still a good, and he himself says, I'm an old Henry Clay Whig. So he takes those three great proposals of the Whigs about a national banking system, about tariffs, and about national support for infrastructure. And he puts all three of those into place as his domestic agenda. You know, Madam Mayor, a lot of the times when we think about Lincoln, we think about him as the great wartime president in the Civil War, and all the drums and the bugles drown out this very extensive domestic program that Lincoln is able to get through Congress. He gets the biggest infrastructure bill in American history passed, and that's the Transcontinental Railroad. He gets a national banking system adopted that standardizes United States currency, and he actually persuades Congress to impose the highest protective tariff rates in American history. So this is someone who is, yes, he does some very dramatic things that way, but it's been building toward that. It's been building towards it all through his life. It's been building through examples of people like Henry Clay, for whom Lincoln, Clay was his beau ideal of a statesman. Right. We've been moving toward that. And I think there's a certain inevitability. I think, maybe I'm going to shitting out on a limb here, but I think the entire idea of having the Constitutional Convention was a move towards greater federal authority. Just the idea that you are creating this union that is going to be a more perfect union than the Articles of Confederation, that is going to provide for the general welfare, that is going to ensure domestic tranquility, and above all, which is put into place by the authority of what, the states? No, we, the people of the United States. That in itself is a step towards the recognition of national authority. So from there is a gradual movement up, and Lincoln stands at the top of a very long staircase that is being built towards that in 1861.
Point well taken. I understand. I appreciate that. When you think about it, we've had contemporary
personalities who said they could have cut a deal and avoided the Civil War. And,
Really?
you almost do have to ask, though, how on earth did people remain so tenacious? That was an awful war and a very personal war. What was the driving force? I mean, what kept them going to do that for 4 years?
People who think, or who thought then, that somehow you could deal your way out of this crisis and compromise your way out of this crisis, totally underestimated the almost fanatical dedication of the Southern states to slavery as a system. There are a multiplicity of causal elements at work. Federalism, and what I mean by that is a wrong view of what federalism is. That created part of this situation. Sectionalism created part of this situation. But at the end of the day, it is slavery, which is the key factor. Take slavery out of the equation and there's no Civil War. Leave slavery in there. I don't care how many other deals you cut, how many other compromises you make, you are going to come to war. Now that's where I'm starting to sound inevitable. But as long as slavery is there, slavery is an act of defiance against the Declaration of Independence, against American identity itself. It is an act of defiance of any authority that tries to say, you may not own another human being the way you would own a horse or a pig or a dog. You may not. No, that kind of defiance of that authority, that's what feeds these people. And yes, it gives us a war of 4 years duration and hundreds of thousands of deaths. The estimates vary, probably somewhere between 650 and 750,000 deaths, direct or indirect. When you do that by the percentages in today's United States population, you'd be talking about the deaths of something like 15 to 20 million people. This is the price we pay in the Civil War. No wonder when Lincoln speaks in the second inaugural about the causes of the war. Yes, he identifies slavery. And then he takes one step further because he knew what people would conclude when he said that. People who were hearing him would conclude, yeah, we Northerners are innocent of that. It's those Southerners who are guilty of slavery. Lincoln says, no. The war has been of such catastrophic dimensions that we can only understand why God has visited this on us if we understand that North and South alike have both been implicated in the evil of slavery. And if you don't like hearing that, Lincoln says, if that offends you, then don't take it up with me, because that is what God says. And he asks the question, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Who's going to disagree with him on that point? So yes, he sees slavery
He does.
as being so important because the people that clung to it, oh my goodness, they clung to it with this almost manic, fanatical determination. And the sad part is that determination does not disappear at Appomattox. It goes underground for a while, and then it surfaces in new forms of oppression and manipulation. And it's almost as though we get to 30 years after the Civil War, we get to Plessy versus Ferguson, and you scratch your head and you wonder, what did we fight this war for? I thought the result was supposed to be somewhere in a different direction. And yet that stubbornness, that refusal to yield to the basic points of the Declaration of Independence, that not only cost us so much in the way of carnage in the Civil War itself, but it cost us decades. That led us to lynching, it led us to Jim Crow, leads us even today to all the racial conundrums and controversies that we deal with even in our own lives at this moment.
No, I think Isabel Wilkerson, her book Caste, I found that the most useful way to deal with the construct of it, which is a caste system where everybody buys into it. And even if you are a victim, you kind of buy into it. But that also highlights Lincoln. I mean, he moved from being a man who morally opposed slavery, but struggled with the notion of the two races being able to coexist, to actually speaking of a franchise, and possibly the reason why he was assassinated, many believe, by John Wilkes Booth.
Who said that?
Yeah.
Who said that? He heard Lincoln say in his last speech on April 11th, 1865, we've got to move towards extending the franchise to the freed slaves. And Booth turns to his accomplice, David Harold, and he says, I know what that means. That means black voting rights. I'll put him through.
So
And
his last speech he'll give.
3 days later, what does Booth do? Yeah.
Yeah. So before I ask you about, well, do you think Frederick Douglass, though, played a larger than life role in prodding him? One, if nothing else, by having African-American men in the military, which I think would have to, as I believe with George Washington, having William Lee as valet with him in the war, it makes you think differently about the humanity and dignity of a person, I would have to believe.
I remember this one letter that a Hessian captain wrote back home during the Revolution, because he was really puzzled by that. He'd never seen anything like this before. He says, every regiment of these American rebels has got black people in it. It was like, what? How can that possibly be? But what he was describing was something he actually saw on the ground in the Revolution. Well, for Lincoln, I'll say two things about Lincoln that way. One is nobody ever pushes Lincoln to do anything. That's Abraham Lincoln. You don't push him. He might push you, but you don't push him. He moves on his own speed. He moves on his own fuel. He was not the kind of person that you could put into a corner and make go in a certain direction. That simply was not part of his character. But one thing that Lincoln sees in Frederick Douglass is something very akin to himself. There's an experience that they both had. They never talked about to each other, at least that I know of, but they both had a common experience. One was this: when Lincoln was, 15, 16, 17, he had this little side hustle. He had a little boat that he would use to paddle out to the middle of the Ohio River. And he would carry passengers out there in that boat because that was where they flagged down the passing steamboats. Well, one day, two men come running down in a hurry and they say, take us out to midstream. We want to get on board that steamboat. So he takes them out there. And when they get on the boat, they turn around and to Lincoln, they both flip him a silver $50. Lincoln looks at that and he says, I've earned that all on my own. I can keep that. And Lincoln said, he told that story repeatedly. And he said, from that point, life looked fairer and more attractive to me. Frederick Douglass has almost the same thing. When he arrives in New Bedford, he's got to figure out what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And he walks down the street and a woman hails him and says, could you come in here and help? She wants him to split some wood, which he does. She turns around and gives him $1. He looks at that and says, I've never been paid for my work before. I can keep this. For both Douglass and Lincoln, there was this common experience of starting from nothing, sometimes less than nothing, and then moving up from that. And Douglass said years later that one of the things that he found most remarkable about meeting Lincoln for the first time was that Lincoln made no reference whatever to what Douglass called the difference of color between the two men. He said he was the first great man in America I ever met who never made any reference that way. Instead, Douglass said, what I had was the clear sense that what Lincoln and I saw in each other was someone who had come up from nothing or next to nothing or less than nothing, and who had achieved much and who wanted to see others achieve the same thing. And that creates this bond between Lincoln and Douglass that will lead Douglass to make visits to the White House. After Lincoln gives his second inaugural address, Douglass gets in the line of visitors at the White House. Lincoln sees him. He says, there is my friend Douglass. What did you think of the speech? And Douglass is sort of taken aback. The president of the United States is asking me what I think of his speech. And Douglass says, it was a sacred effort. that captures something really remarkable in these two men. And years later, Douglas gives this speech. I mean, he makes his living basically as a public orator, as a public speaker. He has a speech that he gives, oh my goodness, some 220 times in his career, called Self-Made Men. Well, he's talking about himself. But who is the primary example that he's offering? Abraham Lincoln.
Mhm.
And you almost have the sense that in Douglas's mind, he's almost joined himself and Lincoln together as though they were one kind of personality, the kind of personality that can only flourish in the American environment. So for him, that connection to Lincoln is an extremely important thing. And it's important for Lincoln because Lincoln wants Douglas to help him recruit Black soldiers for the Union Army.
And when I said that the role of Frederick Douglass, Lincoln continued to grow.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
had a moral compass, and you have to appreciate, one does appreciate that. I certainly do. Somebody who's a political personality, as was Abraham Lincoln, very political,
Oh, yes.
but who had this moral compass, but had the capacity to learn and grow, capacity to listen, capacity to grasp what is it that this person is bringing to the conversation that I may have missed. And we're all going to miss something because we have a limited, our life
yeah.
experiences are different.
Yeah.
And that's what I meant. And he had to get there in a sufficient way to pull the country to follow him. I mean, a country that, whatever their position, was wedded to this caste system is something we've not totally, liberated ourselves from.
Lincoln always had a sharp eye for what is possible in public opinion. I mean, he once made this comment that, especially in a democratic environment, public opinion is everything. You have to bring public opinion with you. You can't defy it because otherwise it will overwhelm you. It'll crush you. All right, how do you develop public opinion? For him, first of all, it takes patience. And this is a man of great patience. It takes resilience. And this is a man who can absorb a lot of punishment. It's remarkable in a politician. He's also a man of humility. He doesn't get up on his own high horse. He's willing to see other people take credit for things if it will move the overall moment and cause in the right direction. But he has such a clear, sophisticated view of things. There were no polls and no Gallup polls or things like that in his day. He had to rely on what people might tell him, on what he might read, but he had this coup of the eye that allowed him to identify what was important and what wasn't. Out of the great mass of news and information that would come his way, he could pick out the really important things that would say, well, this is where we're going in 6 months. This is where we'll be in 18 months. And one of his political friends who paid a visit to him in the White House, who was very despairing at one point, went to Lincoln and said, "Oh, woe is us." Lincoln got this little notebook out of his coat. And then into this notebook, Lincoln had pasted these little excerpts from a newspaper account here, from a convention report here. He pasted them all together and he walked his friend through and he says, this is where we're headed. 6 months from now, this is where we're going to be. Here's where the trends are taking us. His friend left the office thinking, this is great. I'm optimistic now. Why? Lincoln had that sense of recognition of what was really important and where things were really going. And he understood how to develop that and how to nurture that. And he's always thinking. He's a very cautious person, but at the same time, he's always thinking, how can we keep the momentum? He said to members of Congress at one point, he's very impatient with the members of the border state delegations because these are states that have stayed in the Union, 4 of them, but they're still places that legalize slavery. He says, will you not recognize the signs of the times? Will you not see where we're going? Emancipate now. Do it now, because sooner or later, the war is going to end slavery, and you'll end up the losers for it. So take the action now. he sees where things are going. He understands where the movement is, and he wants to push the country and pull the country so that people are able to grasp that. And you know, by the end of his life, you see so much of that. One person who gave a eulogy for Lincoln 4 days after Lincoln's death, he was a man from Massachusetts. He said that he had the impression that Lincoln never thought of himself as a president, as a ruler who's handing down declarations to people. He always had the sense that Lincoln thought of himself as the attorney general for the people, that he was representing the interests of the people to the people themselves. He was a great persuader. Well, he was a trial lawyer, he should be, but he was still a great persuader. And you see that all through his speeches, you see it through his writings as president. He was tremendous at pulling people along in ways that they themselves would never have seen them moving 4 years before.
Well, before I ask you about where his position is within that pantheon of presidents, do you think that his semi-deity status may lie in the fact, and maybe this was providential, I can tend to think so, that the war ends on Palm Sunday. By happenstance, John Wilkes Booth ends up finding out he's going to be at Ford's Theater on Good Friday, and the fatal shot occurs then. It's Holy Week. I mean, people are gathering at synagogues that day he dies. And then the rest of the country, primarily Christians, gather that Sunday on Easter, where in each instance he's compared to both Moses and, of course, to Christ. Yes. I mean, more has been written about him than any other president. When we gather now to express our hopes and aspirations, we do it in that we're standing in front of his monument. Do you think he is a providential president? Do you think that it was just happenstance that he has this position in our collective thinking?
Well, I'll preface my response by saying, first of all, as a caution, that the Lord has not revealed it to me yet. I have not had a revelation that says Abraham Lincoln was my chosen representative. So I haven't gotten that revelation. But having said that, I would then go on to say that my best estimate of things is yes. Yes, and in many ways. Think about it this way, Madam Mayor. Look at the presidents who occupied the office before Lincoln. Let's see, what a roster. James Knox Polk, John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan. What a lineup of losers. And at that point you think, is this the best the country can do? And then at this moment of stupendous crisis, who is elected president? Abraham Lincoln. And it was almost as though at the moment when we needed someone like him the most, we got him. One famous German prince, Otto von Bismarck, who I'm not in the habit of quoting as an authority. Bismarck once said that the Lord looks out for fools, drunks, and the United States of America. And I have to say, all right, I'm not sure he meant that as a compliment, but I'm going to take it that way, because if there's anything, it seems to me, that demonstrates that, it's Abraham Lincoln. What good thing did we do? What good thing did we represent? That at the moment when we needed exactly that kind of leader, we got him.
Well, this has been it was providential for us to have had the great honor as we, celebrate this, our 16th president, to have a chance to have this conversation with you, Dr. Guelzo. So it's just been magnificent. So appreciate your scholarship, and so appreciate your sharing your insights and scholarship with us here at IPPH.
I'm always happy to do so, and it doesn't take much. You put a nickel in my meter, I'll talk about Lincoln all day.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciated it.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right.
Too. Thank you for that good word.